You don't realize what you've done until the silence around you starts to change. It was 7:42 a.m. in downtown Atlanta when Marcus Cole stepped off the curb, holding a black briefcase with no markings except a small silver seal that most people would never recognize. He wore a plain navy jacket, a white shirt, and the kind of calm expression that never asked for attention. To anyone passing by, he looked like an ordinary man heading to work, maybe a consultant, maybe a retired veteran, nothing more. But inside that quiet presence was a man who had spent over 2 decades serving in operations most people would never read about, a man whose name carried weight in rooms far beyond this street. Officer Ryan Miller noticed him before he even crossed the intersection. Miller had been on patrol since dawn, already irritated by the slow traffic, the noise, and the feeling that the city never respected authority the way it should. When his eyes locked on Marcus, something small and automatic clicked inside his judgment. A decision formed without questions, without context, without patience. He stepped out of his vehicle and called out, voice sharp enough to cut through the morning air. Marcus paused but did not react with surprise or fear. He simply turned, as if acknowledging someone who might be lost rather than someone in control. That calm response only seemed to reinforce Miller's assumption. The world around them did not stop. Cars moved, people walked, a distant siren echoed somewhere between buildings, but in that narrow space of sidewalk and shadow, attention narrowed. Miller approached with the confidence of someone who believed certainty was the same as truth. He asked for identification. Marcus complied without resistance, placing his hands slowly where they could be seen, reaching for his wallet, his movements steady, deliberate, almost too controlled for the situation. The ID he presented was not what Miller expected, but instead of reading it carefully, instead of processing what stood in front of him, Miller's focus remained fixed on the story he had already written in his mind. The conversation became shorter, colder, less about facts and more about control. Marcus spoke calmly, choosing each word like someone trained to defuse tension rather than escalate it. But his voice carried something deeper beneath it, a restraint that did not belong to fear. Around them, a few pedestrians slowed down, sensing the shift, phones beginning to rise, curiosity turning into documentation. Miller made a decision to escalate the encounter, insisting on procedures that felt heavier than the situation required, his tone growing louder, more certain, more public. Marcus looked at him for a moment, not with anger, but with something closer to disappointment, as if watching a predictable pattern unfold exactly as expected. Then he spoke one sentence, quiet enough that only Miller could fully hear it, a sentence that did not threaten, did not challenge, but simply stated a truth that had not yet been understood. That was the moment everything paused, not because of force, not because of resistance, but because something unseen had just shifted beneath the surface of authority itself. And somewhere far from that street, a call was already being made that would soon change the weight of everything happening in front of them. The air on that Atlanta street began to feel different in the moments after Marcus Cole spoke, as if the city itself had paused to listen for something it could not yet understand. Officer Ryan Miller stood closer now, his posture rigid, his attention locked not on the man in front of him, but on the interpretation he had already decided was correct. Around them, the ordinary rhythm of the morning continued, but subtle fractures in that normalcy were beginning to form. A few pedestrians slowed their pace, their eyes drawn to the interaction, phones lifted slightly higher, recording without fully understanding why. Marcus remained still, his expression unchanged, his calm almost unsettling in contrast to the rising tension around him. He had not moved backward, had not raised his voice, had not attempted to resist or argue beyond simple clarity. That restraint, however, was not being recognized as discipline. It was being misread as defiance by someone trained to see suspicion before understanding. Miller spoke again, louder this time, instructing Marcus to place his belongings on the patrol vehicle. The instruction carried the tone of certainty rather than inquiry, as though the outcome of this moment had already been written. Marcus complied again without hesitation, placing the briefcase down carefully, his movements precise, controlled, almost ceremonial. There was something about the way he acted that did not match the assumptions being made about him, but those details were being ignored. The crowd had grown slightly, drawn not by chaos but by the quiet discomfort of witnessing authority interacting with calm that refused to break. Miller requested backup, not because the situation required it, but because his interpretation of it demanded validation. Within minutes, another patrol unit began to approach from the far end of the street, its presence adding weight to an already unbalanced moment. Marcus looked briefly toward the arriving vehicle, then back at Miller, his eyes steady, reflecting neither fear nor anger, only recognition that the situation was moving in a direction that would soon correct itself. He spoke again, his voice low, reminding Miller that escalation was unnecessary, that procedures could be handled without turning observation into assumption, but his words did not land as intended. Instead, they reinforced the belief that he was avoiding compliance. Miller stepped slightly closer, maintaining control of the space between them, insisting that identity verification would continue on his terms. The briefcase remained untouched on the patrol vehicle, its presence becoming a silent focal point for those watching. Somewhere in the distance, an engine's sound changed pitch, deeper and more deliberate than a civilian vehicle. A black sport utility vehicle appeared at the edge of the street, moving slowly at first, then stopping with precision that contrasted sharply with the uncertainty unfolding nearby. Its arrival shifted the atmosphere immediately, not through noise, but through recognition from those trained to notice it. The doors opened simultaneously, and a man in a military uniform stepped out, his posture direct, his gaze immediately locking onto the center of the scene. The surrounding crowd instinctively adjusted, some stepping back, others freezing entirely, sensing that the situation had entered a new phase that no longer belonged solely to local authority. Officer Miller noticed the change in energy before he understood its source. The arriving figure did not rush, did not speak immediately, but the way he approached carried institutional weight that could not be mistaken. Marcus remained still, watching the arrival without reaction, as if he had already anticipated this moment long before it occurred. The distance between misunderstanding and consequence was about to collapse, not through confrontation, but through recognition that would redefine everything that had just taken place. The arrival of the black sport utility vehicle changed the air on the street in a way that no spoken command could have achieved. It was not speed or sound that caused the shift, but recognition. The man who stepped out from the passenger side wore a United States Army uniform, pressed and precise, carrying the kind of presence that does not need introduction. Colonel James Walker moved forward with measured steps, his attention fixed entirely on the center of the scene where Marcus Cole stood. Officer Ryan Miller straightened slightly without realizing it, his instincts reacting before his understanding caught up. Around them, the small crowd had fallen into a quieter stillness, the kind that follows when people sense they are no longer witnessing a routine interaction, but something with higher consequence. Marcus did not turn immediately toward the arriving officer. Instead, he remained focused on Miller, his expression unchanged, as if the arrival had confirmed something he already knew would happen. Colonel Walker stopped several feet away, assessing the situation in a single continuous scan that included the patrol vehicle, the briefcase, and the people gathered around. His gaze returned to Marcus, and in that moment, the weight of understanding became visible. There was no confusion in his eyes, only recognition. Officer Miller attempted to speak first, beginning to explain the situation in a tone that tried to maintain control, but his words felt increasingly out of place as the presence of the military officer reframed everything around him. Walker raised a hand slightly, not in aggression, but in a gesture that paused the exchange without force. He asked for clarification, not from Miller, but from Marcus. That choice alone shifted the center of authority in the scene. Marcus finally turned toward Walker, his voice calm, explaining that he had been stopped during a routine walk, and that procedures had escalated beyond necessity. His tone carried no accusation, only statement of fact. Walker listened without interruption, his expression steady, absorbing each detail without reaction that would signal judgment too early. Officer Miller, now visibly unsettled, attempted to reassert his authority by referencing standard procedure, but the confidence behind his words had begun to weaken under the weight of the new presence. The briefcase on the patrol vehicle remained untouched, but its significance had grown in the silence between exchanges. Walker stepped closer to it, not touching it yet, simply acknowledging it as part of the situation. He then turned slightly toward Miller and asked a simple question about identification protocol and chain of observation. The question was calm, almost administrative, but it carried implications that made the surrounding silence feel heavier. Miller responded, but his explanation lacked the certainty it had held only minutes earlier. The crowd remained still, no longer reacting as individuals, but as witnesses to a process they did not fully understand. Walker finally reached for a small identification card presented by Marcus earlier and examined it carefully. The moment he processed what he was seeing, his posture shifted subtly, not in shock, but in confirmation. He exhaled slowly, then looked directly at Marcus and acknowledged him with a formal military salute. That single motion altered the entire structure of the scene without a word being spoken. Officer Miller froze, his understanding of authority breaking apart in real time as he tried to reconcile what he was witnessing. The realization was not immediate in words, but in silence, as the distance between assumption and reality collapsed completely in front of everyone present. The moment Colonel James Walker held the formal salute, the entire street seemed to lose its previous definition. It was no longer a simple intersection in downtown Atlanta, no longer a routine patrol encounter, and no longer an interaction governed by local assumptions. It had become something else entirely, something structured by hierarchy that extended far beyond what Officer Ryan Miller had been trained to interpret. Miller stood rigid, his hands near his belt, but his posture no longer carried authority. It carried uncertainty. Marcus Cole returned the salute with the same calm precision, his expression unchanged, as though the recognition was not surprising but simply overdue. Walker lowered his hand and shifted his attention fully to Miller. The silence between them was not empty. It was evaluative, measuring every detail of what had just occurred. Walker asked for a complete account of the detention from the beginning, his voice steady and controlled. Miller began to respond, but his words now lacked the structure they had carried earlier. He described the initial suspicion, the request for identification, and the perceived lack of clarity in Marcus's presence, but each sentence sounded increasingly fragile under scrutiny. Marcus did not interrupt. He stood still, holding his position with the same discipline that had defined him since the encounter began. Around them, the small group of bystanders remained frozen in place, no longer reacting emotionally, but instead observing a shift in power that was unfolding through dialogue rather than force. Walker listened carefully, occasionally glancing at Marcus, then back to Miller, as if aligning the spoken account with the reality he was now confirming. When Miller finished, there was a brief pause that extended longer than comfortable. Walker then asked a single question about authorization and identification verification procedures, delivered without emphasis but with unmistakable weight. Miller hesitated before answering, and in that hesitation, the imbalance became clear. Walker turned slightly, addressing Marcus again, and confirmed details that only someone with full awareness of military classification could validate. The briefcase on the patrol vehicle remained untouched, yet its presence now felt symbolic, as if it represented a boundary that had already been crossed. Marcus finally spoke again, stating that he had attempted compliance throughout the interaction and had maintained transparency at every stage. His tone carried neither anger nor frustration, only the clarity of someone documenting reality after the fact. Walker nodded once, acknowledging the statement, then turned back to Miller. The conversation that followed was no longer about interpretation but about process, review, and accountability. Miller attempted to clarify his intent once more, but his explanation no longer aligned with the facts being assembled in real time. Walker raised his hand slightly again, signaling that the explanation was no longer necessary at this stage. A second vehicle arrived quietly at the edge of the street, unmarked and without urgency, its presence reinforcing that the situation had moved beyond local jurisdiction. Two individuals stepped out and approached Walker, exchanging brief, formal acknowledgments. No one raised their voice. No one moved abruptly. Yet the structure of authority had clearly shifted away from the original encounter. Marcus remained at the center of it all, still and composed, while Officer Miller now stood at the periphery of his own decision, watching as the consequences of misjudgment unfolded through institutional response rather than confrontation. The air felt heavier not because of conflict, but because of realization settling into place without resistance. What had begun as a single assumption had expanded into something far larger, and every person present understood, even without words, that the outcome was no longer uncertain. The procedural silence that had settled over the street was no longer passive. It had become active, structured, and deliberate, as if every movement now belonged to a system that had absorbed the situation and was processing it beyond human reaction. Officer Ryan Miller stood near the edge of the formation of officials, no longer addressed directly, no longer guiding the direction of events, but still present as a witness to the unfolding consequence of his initial decision. His earlier certainty had dissolved into a steady, uncomfortable awareness that nothing around him was operating within the expectations he had carried into this encounter. Colonel James Walker remained beside Marcus Cole, occasionally exchanging brief confirmations with the arriving federal personnel, each exchange precise and restrained. Marcus himself had not moved from his position. His calm remained consistent, not shifting with the changes in authority around him, as though his role in the moment had already been completed the instant recognition occurred. The black sport utility vehicle that had arrived earlier now sat idle at the edge of the street, its presence no longer signaling arrival but closure. A formal request was made for all accounts of the incident to be recorded in sequence, beginning from initial contact. Miller complied, his voice noticeably more measured than before, as he described the sequence of his actions. Each sentence he spoke was carefully documented by the federal representatives, not with judgment, but with precision. Marcus provided confirmation only when directly asked, and his responses remained consistent, factual, and devoid of emotional framing. Colonel Walker observed quietly, occasionally adjusting his stance as if aligning himself with the procedural weight of what was being established. There was no urgency in the process, only inevitability. The crowd that had formed earlier had thinned slightly, though a few individuals remained, still holding their phones, still absorbing the transformation of a routine street encounter into a formal matter of record involving multiple levels of authority. Miller was asked to step fully aside as the review progressed, and he did so without resistance, positioning himself a few feet away from the center of activity. His hands remained still, but his focus was fragmented, shifting between the officials, Marcus, and the unfolding documentation process that no longer required his input. One of the federal representatives reviewed a final confirmation with Colonel Walker, who acknowledged it with a single nod. Marcus stood unchanged, his presence steady, no longer interpreted through suspicion or assumption, but through verified identity. The contrast between the beginning of the encounter and its current state was no longer implicit. It was visible in every procedural action taking place. The initial escalation had been reduced to a sequence of recorded facts, each one reinforcing a structure that had corrected itself through recognition rather than confrontation. Miller was asked for a final written statement summarizing his perspective, and he complied, though his earlier confidence no longer appeared in his posture or tone. The environment remained quiet, not because tension had disappeared, but because it had been absorbed into process. Marcus finally shifted his gaze toward the horizon of the street, his expression unchanged, as if the matter no longer required his direct presence to remain resolved. Colonel Walker stood beside him, offering a brief acknowledgement that the situation would proceed through full institutional review. The federal team continued their documentation without interruption, ensuring that every detail was captured in formal sequence. What remained on the street was no longer an encounter defined by uncertainty, but a concluded event transitioning into official record, with each participant now assigned a place within a narrative that had already been determined by truth rather than assumption. The final stage of the review process unfolded with a level of calm precision that contrasted sharply with how the situation had begun earlier that morning. The street in downtown Atlanta remained partially cordoned off, not through forceful restriction, but through quiet procedural control established by federal presence and military oversight. Officer Ryan Miller stood at a measured distance from the central group, no longer part of the conversation, but still physically present as required by protocol. His earlier certainty had been replaced by a subdued awareness of how quickly interpretation could collapse under verified structure. Colonel James Walker remained beside Marcus Cole, maintaining a steady posture that reflected both recognition and responsibility. Marcus himself had not shifted in demeanor since the beginning of the review. His calm presence remained unchanged, as if the external validation of his identity had only confirmed a reality that had always existed regardless of how it was initially perceived. The federal representatives continued their documentation, completing the final stages of the recorded sequence. Each statement, each confirmation, and each procedural acknowledgement was being entered into formal record without interruption. There was no urgency in their movements, only completion. Miller was approached once more for final clarification, and he provided it in a voice that was noticeably restrained compared to earlier exchanges. The words he used were factual, but the confidence behind them had diminished significantly. Marcus did not respond to the clarification. Instead, he remained still, allowing the process to conclude without further involvement. Colonel Walker exchanged a final acknowledgement with the lead federal official, signaling the completion of on-site verification. A brief moment of silence followed, not heavy with tension, but defined by resolution. The situation that had begun as an assumption-driven encounter had now transitioned fully into a formal case record, stripped of interpretation and grounded entirely in documented fact. Miller stood quietly as the officials completed their final procedural steps. There was no confrontation, no escalation, only the steady conclusion of a process that had corrected itself through institutional structure. Marcus finally adjusted his stance slightly, not as a reaction to the environment, but as a natural release of stillness after prolonged attention. Walker offered a brief nod in his direction, acknowledging both his presence and the outcome without further elaboration. The federal team began to disperse in an orderly manner, leaving behind only those necessary for continued administrative processing. The street gradually returned to its normal rhythm, though the significance of what had occurred remained embedded in the awareness of those who had witnessed it. Officer Miller remained in place for a few moments longer than the others, observing the departure of authority figures who no longer required his participation. Marcus turned slightly and began to walk away with measured steps, accompanied by Colonel Walker for a short distance before they separated. No additional words were exchanged. The briefcase was retrieved and carried without ceremony, its importance no longer tied to uncertainty but to resolution. As Marcus continued down the sidewalk, his presence blended once again into the ordinary flow of the city, though the weight of what had occurred followed in the silence behind him. The encounter had ended not with disruption, but with confirmation, leaving behind a clear record of truth established through recognition, process, and undeniable identity. The morning in downtown Atlanta continued to move forward as if nothing extraordinary had occurred. Yet for those who had been present, the city felt permanently altered in subtle ways that could not be easily described. Traffic lights cycled through their normal sequence, pedestrians crossed intersections with routine focus, and storefronts reopened their doors to the flow of daily life. But beneath that surface rhythm there remained an invisible imprint of what had taken place earlier. Officer Ryan Miller sat inside his patrol vehicle for a long moment before driving, his hands resting on the steering wheel without immediate motion. The radio crackled occasionally with standard dispatch updates, but none of it felt connected to the experience he had just lived through. When he finally began to move, it was at a slower pace than usual, his attention divided between the road ahead and the internal replay of events that no longer aligned with his initial interpretation. There was no external consequence visible in that moment, but the internal recalibration was already underway. Far from the intersection, Marcus Cole continued walking with steady rhythm, his briefcase in hand, his posture unchanged from earlier. The city around him had returned to its natural state, but the way he moved through it now carried a quiet separation from the uncertainty that had briefly surrounded him. Colonel James Walker had parted ways earlier, leaving Marcus to proceed alone. No additional security detail followed him, no formal escort remained, and yet the environment no longer treated him as unseen or misinterpreted. The recognition that had occurred earlier did not need to be repeated to remain valid. It had already been established and recorded through formal channels. As Marcus crossed another block, he paused briefly at a corner, observing the movement of people and vehicles around him. There was no urgency in his expression, only a calm awareness that the situation had fully transitioned from misunderstanding to resolution. Meanwhile, Officer Miller had returned to his station, where routine activity resumed without interruption. Reports were processed, calls were handled, and standard procedures continued as they always had. However, Miller remained noticeably quieter than usual, his focus less engaged with external tasks and more occupied with internal reflection. The earlier encounter had already been entered into official documentation, and while the procedural aspect of it had concluded, the personal impact remained unresolved. Across the city, life maintained its consistent rhythm, unaffected in structure but subtly marked by the events that had occurred. Marcus eventually reached a more populated avenue where his presence blended naturally into the movement of the crowd. No one reacted to him differently, yet the context of his identity, once misunderstood, now carried a clarity that no longer required external validation. The morning had progressed from assumption to verification, from misinterpretation to recognition, and finally into procedural closure. What remained was not disruption, but understanding recorded in action and memory alike, forming a quiet conclusion to a sequence that had begun with uncertainty and ended with undeniable confirmation.